This is on. Okay, so here is a story for you. A man sits down, tens of thousands take to the streets in protest. True story, happening now. So when we decided to have a session on the future of protests, as part of ZAG Festival, we thought we would talk about how social media and technology are changing the nature of protests around the world. Then a Russian MP did us a big favor by providing some very, very useful illustration. So as a team, we decided that we couldn't possibly have this session without some of the people who have been out in the streets of Tbilisi protesting for the last 3 days. We have opened the session to public, and we are live streaming it on Facebook as well. And moderating the session will be the Guardian's Eastern Europe correspondent, Shaun Walker, who has covered his fair share of protests in his career. Shaun, would you like to come up and introduce your panel?
Thank you very much, Natalia, for the invite and for this fantastic festival. Really looking forward to the final session. We have a great panel. We have Peter Pomeranzev, the author of a book called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and of a new book called This Is Not Propaganda, which is all about protests, so we'll be talking about that. We have Levan Ghambashidze, who is a philosopher. And some of you may recognize him, he's been leading the recent History of Georgia tours in the morning, which turned into very recent History of Georgia tours. And finally, we have Tamar Cheirgoleshvili, who is an activist and the founder of Tabula Media. So I think we have to start with Georgia and what's happening the past couple of days. And to me, what's interesting about this, as Natalia said, traveling a lot, seeing a lot of different protests. And right now I live in Hungary, which is a country where the government has essentially taken over the media, pretty much got rid of civil society, not much of an opposition, incredibly corrupt, and yet almost very little protest. They haven't had to put anyone in jail. They haven't had to beat anyone up. People have simply kind of, in some way or another, either left or put up with it. Then you come here in Georgia, and we're all coming to ZEG, and there's this vague story, a Russian MP sat down in Parliament. That's probably, clearly symbolic, but it sounds quite a minor thing. Suddenly, tear gas running, rubber bullets, etc., and thousands of people out. So, what is it? Is there a historical reasons? Are there cultural reasons why you think in some countries we see much more active protest than in others? And specifically, what's the background to this recent protest?
May I?
Yeah.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this session. Well, I haven't sort of thought about the future of protests, so whatever I'm going to say is not going to be very smart, probably, but I will try to make a point. Well, the thing is that you just compared Hungary to Georgia, and I don't think the comparison is right, because Hungary has a political problem, and the political system is flawed in Hungary, and the political leader has problems in Georgia. What we're going through is the social transformation. In Hungary, if the government changes, everything is going to be fine, the society is modernized. Unlike Georgia, where we are going through social transformation, because after the fall of Soviet Union, that's exactly what we are going through, and I believe that the Rose Revolution was kind of the startup point to that, when the Georgia's social transformation started, and this is what we're witnessing now, and those protests are the good example for me. And the thing is that, this is a bit sort of funny how everything has started, because I'm hosting a talk show, late night talk show, every Thursday on TV Pirveli, and not last, but the one before the last Thursday, me and my partner Vachos Anaya, we were talking about changing electoral system, how it would resolve many issues Georgia has now. We had switched from mixed, like single mandate system, like to only proportional system. And like I was saying that without pressure from the street, nothing is going to happen because the government is not ready to compromise on that. And he was saying, yes, but there are no signs of street pressure or anything. And I was saying, because this content is so high with the government, it's like a room filled with the gas. You just need to light a match and it may explode. And we were just thinking it like 2 days earlier, before everything has started. And how it has started, that's also kind of interesting. You know, June is the Pride Month. And like Georgian LGBT community was about to organize like the Pride activities, and this is the favorite Russia subject because I mean they can use their famous tool for their propaganda, saying that okay, those like Western nations are forcing you to lose your cultural identity. You are all gonna become gay. So they sent to us their like clown who is the Russian version of Georgian, like he looks like an eagle, dandy kind of type, like Levan has 9 children. Probably he's gay, I believe so, but I mean, I'm not. Yeah, that's my belief. That's my belief. But,
He denies the allegation.
Yeah, and he came here and he was talking about like attacking like LGBT rally, like sort of organizing some bands and like bashing the Western like ambassadors for instructing like Georgian government to allow this rally in the street, that we're losing our identity and all these things. And suddenly a Russian MP comes like to Georgia, sits in the chair, and 30,000 people are standing in the street, and like and there is a crisis. There is a crisis. So, I mean, it just backfired for Russians. I mean, they started with like sort of instigating anti-Western sentiments, and suddenly a Russian guy comes and everything is just like exploding now. And like the chairman of the parliament has resigned just because the Russian guy came and sat in the parliament.
But if we take the Russia equation out of it, why are 30,000 people ready to go and do that? In many countries, there's discontent. Why are they willing to go out and?
The thing is that they were not going out until now. I mean, it took them some time. And in Georgia, like if you take the history of Georgia and analyze the history of protests in Georgia, I mean, Georgians are never coming out to protest like that they are hungry. They're not coming out to protest that lari has devalued. They're not coming out to protest like, but they need something more, you know, like during the previous government, it was like the government is taking from us the dignity, our dignity, and now Russia became the unifying issue. And they're just unhappy with the government. They want change, and Gavrilo was just the nice purpose, like to do that. Mm-hmm. Because it was really insulting. When Georgians, for many Georgians, it was really insulting to see him in the chair of the chairman of the parliament, which is the major, like sort of the source of power, should be the source of power if we didn't have an oligarch who is informally governing the country. Yeah.
Sure. Levan, well, maybe you could. How do you feel that this wave of protest fits into the kind of story of Georgia over the transformation period of the last 30 years?
Good afternoon. First of all, I agree with Tamar's analysis. The thing is that, as it was mentioned, the history of protest in Georgia, it's very specific since 2012, because the political system itself, it's very specific. Somehow it's not political anymore. I'll try to explain what I mean. Today's government is controlled by some guy who is the billionaire of Ghambashidze, the guy who is the shareholder in Gazprom, which is the Russian state-funded or state-controlled company. And this is the most influential man ever in the party of Georgian Dream, so he decides a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, what we have today is that nobody is responsible for what's going on in the country, because all responsibility goes to the guy who controls the party. And that's why the political system is strange. So we, as the citizens of Georgia, wherever we protested to something, it was shooting in the air, because the target was never there in the political field. So wherever you go and protest in front of the parliament of Georgia, the real man with power sits in some other place. But unfortunately, he is not responsible for any political deed, what he does. So 7 years, basically, he had power, and real political power, when he was prime minister of Georgia once, after elections, but then he resigned and he said, no, it's better to control everything outside of the political field. So what we do is, it seems for me as some simulation of politics, because the real power of control is not in the hands of the people who should be responsible for it, like prime minister or any other ministers. We saw it actually yesterday, 2 days before, when prime minister, for example, the guy who has to be in control of the situation in such a tensioned moment of the country, he said that the signature of Georgian Dream is not to shoot at the people and to throw the gas. And half an hour later, police did exactly this, what he refused. So there is only one chance that the Prime Minister of Georgia, he had no idea what's going to happen in half an hour. So where was the decision made? That's a question. We know 100% that if Prime Minister never knows, or if the decision of targeting the crowd is not from Prime Minister, then who should be responsible? The one way is to speak about the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but we also know that this guy is under control of Ghambashidze. So today what we are protesting, it's again shooting in the air, because the real decisions went from Ghambashidze, and unfortunately what we see 2 days already, there is no single politician who is willing to come to the crowd, even to the television, and just to say that this was made by us, or this guy was responsible, or stuff like that. So basically they are hiding because they know, and we know, that the real order came from outside. So the problem is that why now and why such a big crowd? Before, and Tamara knows it well, because she's very much involved in the political protests since 2012, every time when we have protested something, the government had basically two narratives, how they tried to refuse every single accusation. For example, wherever they did something bad, they pointed fingers to the former government. For us, this change of government, we did it only once, peacefully. Other times, we all the time had the revolutions, civil wars. And now in 2012, it's the first time when the former government gave power to the opposition. This is the first time. But unfortunately, we never knew how to manage this power. So every time when the government did something bad, the government used the former government to say that everything what's going on bad, is the former government to blame. So people who hated the former government never agreed with the opposition, who was right all the time, not all the time, but maybe the majority of the times, to the ideas they were fighting for. Because they were somehow, they saw the political opposition as willing to come to the power again. And a lot of people never wanted to participate in the political struggle for the former government to take power again. And today the issue is exactly this, that this, the Russian MP, right, sitting in the chair of parliament, so on, the head of the parliament, this is not political game anymore. So in the level of politics, everybody, every citizen of Georgia is now somehow feeling that this is totally wrong. And this is not the political game anymore. So what we are protesting right now, and if you go to the protest and you'll see, first day, politicians were there. Second day, the crowd said, no more politicians. Sure. We can discuss, is it right or wrong, but still, people doesn't want to see politicians there, but people are there. So this is...
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we'll come back to the detail of what's going on in Georgia maybe a bit later, but I wanted to broaden out a bit and ask you, Peter. I mean, this seemed to me to be quite a traditional form of protest. I mean, something happened, people got angry, everybody came to the square and shouted, slogans, through things. But in your book, you've been writing about the way that sort of techniques to develop successful protests have developed, and maybe you could talk a bit about what you found on that.
Yeah, so in the book, my next book that's coming out in August, I have a whole section where I talk to people who help train revolutionary activists throughout the world, helped train them in Georgia before the Rose Revolution, worked in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, and one guy in particular who's a very famous activist called Sergio Popovich, who was one of the leaders of the protests that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia in 1999 and 2000. But we were looking at what has changed, because he has a whole theory, kind of like a playbook almost, of how you can, what makes a successful protest and social change. And there's lots of steps, but one of the main ones is having a really clear alternative vision to the regime, which in the 20th century was easy, because it was authoritarianism versus democracy. With Milosevic, it was kind of like, Serbian democracy and internationalism versus aggressive nationalism. And he says one of the main things that's changed is that the new generation of leaders like Orban, like Vucic, I don't know enough about the context here, they're not that stupid. They don't present you with a monolithic ideology that you can develop an alternative to. Orban is, inside the EU. At some level, it's still kind of a democracy, at least on paper. And it's very, very hard to design an alternative vision. Maybe that speaks slightly to what you're saying. And so protests do happen in Hungary, by the way. You get very big protests, but they're meaningless because they're not part of an idea and they're not part of a greater story that you're trying to tell. And the new generation of politicians, they can be a bit Democrat, they can be a bit this, a bit that, they change, they adapt. They don't let themselves become a target quite so easily. And developing that alternative vision is really hard because it used to be, especially here, as you say, moving away from Soviet authoritarianism to democracy, which seemed a very simple story and a very simple contrast, but it's become very complicated. For example, you have, Hungary, which has made that transition and become a quasi-dictatorship. Georgia, and to an extent, Ukraine's overall direction is unclear. And it's that loss of a greater narrative which has really, to his mind, undermined, the overall energy and strategy of protests.
And it seems to me that there's also an issue where leaders like Putin or Orban, seeing as we're talking about storytelling and narratives, it's almost less that they have a strong narrative for themselves and more that they have a strong narrative about what protest will mean and what the opposition means. So in the case of Putin, it's state collapse in 1991. In the case of Orban, it's the refugees will come and flood us. So how does a protest movement work to try and get outside of that and to push its own, to knock down that narrative that the government's pushing?
Yeah, they try to, Putin especially, very strongly tries to make this connection that protests and efforts for democracy lead to bloodshed. That's what the whole of the Ukraine narrative is about. Look, they try democracy, it leads to war. If you look at sort of their propaganda, it's non-stop. The Syrians wanted democracy, look what they got. So definitely they're trying to do that association, not that that protests lead to prosperity, but that protests lead to war. Definitely that's there. But even more so, there's an idiom, a type of language that Putin and other leaders use, which is it's not an ideology, it's kind of a worldview where everything is a conspiracy. In Russia, what I loved during the protests, and I don't know who was spreading this story, but I assume it's someone Kremlin affiliated, not just that sort of the protests were sponsored by the CIA, which is kind of an easy one to do, but actually the protests were engineered by the Kremlin to sort of test people out. And actually, Navalny is just an agent of the Kremlin. To just make everybody feel, well, what's the point of doing anything? We live in a world where we don't understand how power really works. In a world of so many conspiracies, we will never be able to change anything. And that's the whole point of conspiracy theory as a model of propaganda. It undermines your sense that you can change anything. So I think a lot of protests have to be about this idea that you can actually change something. But that's incredibly hard when you've had revolutions in the past and the results were mixed, when you have this non-stop propaganda that the world is a conspiracy and nothing can be changed. So I think a lot of it is about self-empowerment and just about the belief that something can change.
Well, the thing is that I wouldn't compare Georgian Rose Revolution to the revolutions in Ukraine or elsewhere because, no matter what we say, no matter how I hate current government, Georgia is still moving forward with zigzags, but it's still moving forward. That's so far I believe Rose Revolution is successful in its goal. It's too early to tell, as Joan Lai has once said about French Revolution. It's too early to tell. The same goes for Rose Revolution. it's been like how many years? Like, but I mean, the goal of the revolution was to establish like Western liberal democracy, to consolidate Western liberal democracy. But it didn't require only political change, it required also social transformation, because Georgians have to sort of, get used to like the values of liberal democracy, like equality before the law, notwithstanding like whatever like differences we have, like be it like religious, be it sexual, be it gender, be it whatever, ethnic. So I mean, it's a process, and you see the change. And like you just mentioned, like I don't know how Russia became the unifying, but I know when Russia became the unifying subject for the protest electorate, because I mean Georgian protest electorate is extremely divided. I mean, first of all, I mean there is a huge mistrust towards political elite, because I believe like pro-Western political elite doesn't know how to speak to public like in a normal language. I mean, because I mean I don't know, like, and this NGO language, like, which doesn't make anyone, and nobody understands it. And I have that feeling we just don't have the right communication language with people. Otherwise what we're saying is so right, I don't know how can people not understand. It means that we're not talking to them properly. and the thing is that now it's the Russia issue. So now what Peter said about the nihilism and like that I cannot change anything. Now we have this situation here in Georgia, which is quite a dangerous situation, because we have an oligarch which is governing the country, which is controlling the government, legislatory branch of government, judicial branch of government, executive branch of government, which is on a very good terms with church, because what the Orthodox Church is interested in is like just, like to be on the side of whoever is strong, and his assets equal to more than a third of Georgia's GDP. So that's one thing. So that's already a good basis to believe that you're not going to be able to defeat this guy through elections, through normal process. But also, on the other hand, we have another crazy, Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, who says that only revolution is the way to go through, because, I mean, the only thing he wants to do is just to come back to power with absolute power, because like the electoral arithmetics doesn't allow him that, because I mean if we go through elections, I mean he won't be able to have the absolute power. He would need the coalition, or he would need to work in the minority government. So that's not what he wants. So we are like in between those two big guys, stuck between two big guys. One is saying, one just has too much money, like just to cause nihilism, and another one is just saying that, okay, we're not going to be able to, the elections doesn't make any sense. Liberal democracy doesn't make any sense. Democratic process doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, in this situation, I mean, the protest is also quite tricky, because you don't know where it's going to go. So the goal of the protest is, of course, to establish the electoral system that would allow the peaceful change of government the second time, that would sort of consolidate even more our democracy. But on the other hand, if the government doesn't make any kind of compromises, then we don't know where it's going to go and who's going to use that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's where we are now.
Okay. We'll have a bit more discussion up here in a minute, but I wanted to open it up if anybody has a question that they would like to ask. Sure, there's one here. Is it? I'll take one of these.
Hello, now you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you talked a lot about protests, about current one, but we haven't talked about protests which we have since 1989 about Russia, which we're protesting constantly, and not our government. Don't you think we should have discussed it more?
You think we should have discussed the fact that since 1989 people have been protesting about Russia?
No, I think we should have talked more about protests about Russia and not about the government. I think that's the biggest evil we have right now.
Russia?
Yes.
We agree.
I mean, I believe it was mentioned on one or two occasions.
Well, first of all, why was that? I want to continue my talk about why the change is difficult in the current situation and why people never really believe that we can protest to change something. It's about the narratives again. So I think that before 2012, we had a large narrative about Georgia. So how Georgia has to be as a country. So it should be liberal democracy. It has to be presented to the international community as a transit country, or it has to act also in politics with Ukraine or Moldova together to go to EU and stuff like that. So we had a large narrative what we should do as a country in the future. So we had an image of it. After the change, all the large narratives, they just disappeared. So nobody on TV, for example, let's take the small issues on TV and mass media, we all the time had that we had the flags. A lot of people asked me today and yesterday why we have the EU flags when we are not the members of EU, European Union, which is probably strange, but it's nice. It was a part of our narrative. We represented ourselves like we want to be, one day we will be EU, and until then we will have flags. So, nice flags, why not? Huh? So every time when the Georgians were running through the country, they were seeing the EU flags without being members of EU. But it was a part of narrative what we had in our heads. What the government did, they just really, you can't see any large narrative on TV, on Prime Minister. Nobody speaks about who we are as Georgians anymore, really. So basically the main narrative of the former government, it was building a civic nationalist state, something like that. So the equality for everybody. I talk what they were talking about, so I'm not saying what they were doing actually right or wrong. So the narrative was there. And today, whatever you do as a civil activist, it has no power because on the other side, there is no narrative you are opposing. So whatever you say, the government can say that this is exactly what I also do. But I never said it. But I also think like you think. But because government never really said it, you are all the time tricked, because whatever you say, it seems like you are the stupid guy, you never noticed what government was thinking all the time. So this is really, really strange situation. That's why, till now, we had a problem of opposing government, because, for example, if we said, you are pro-Russian because you signed an agreement with Gazprom, they would say, like, we are pro-Russian, Saakashvili started the war with Russia in 2008. Thank you. This is not an answer, right? So, but it worked till now. And exactly why Russia's issue is so large, and exactly because we still remember the 1989 and all the Russian history, is I was talking to Tamar that probably our school really succeeded because we see a lot of people anti-Russian on the anti-Russian rally, the young people. They were, 10 years maybe, or even 8 years when the last Russian-Georgian war happened, but still they are there, without even the government to have the strong anti-Russian narrative. So something worked well. So a lot of people are still against of Russia in Georgia, which I think this is a good thing as for the sovereign country to have, because we have a problem with the state. So the Russian issue is national issue. This is not, that's why I said it is not a political issue for us. It's larger than the small political issue. That's why today a lot of people are addressed as Georgians in general and not as members of different small groups who want to change something. That's why you see the representatives of all kinds on the yesterday's and today's before rallies.
Well, can I
Sure,
add something
yeah.
to that? Of course, our struggle with Russia and liberation has started way earlier. Why should we start from '89? We can start from 1921, because that's when we were occupied. But the thing is that there are ups and downs in the attitudes, and we saw for instance, for me it was a shock. I remember when the attitudes changed towards Russia and Russia became something which could have dragged many different people out in the streets. That was the time when Tatunashvili was the Georgian guy was kidnapped and tortured by Russian proxy Ossetian authorities and we couldn't even get the body. And one day I'm waking up And like I see that like there is on Facebook they're discussing like some letter that former Prime Minister of Georgia, also like the sort of a puppet Prime Minister, like Cheirgoleshvili, has sent some letter to Russian government like asking for the body, for the remnants of the guy who was tortured. And well, my husband, like who was about to comment on that, asked me, okay, why don't you read it so that you tell me like what's wrong with that, so that I get the point. So I'm reading it, and like it was nothing different from what they were saying before to me, because to me like Georgian Dream was always like sort of a kind of a like more pro-Russian kind of force. I mean, it was not a surprise for me to read like some sort of like letter that like looked really bad. So I said it's like a normal Georgian Dream kind of stuff, you know, like really bad letter. And then suddenly I start checking my news feed and I see people are angry. People are really angry and there is a huge uproar. And I'm telling my husband, Giga, something is changing here because this guy is not saying anything like that he had never said before. Actually, this government came to power by saying that Georgia shouldn't be the point of sort of opposite disagreement between Russia and the West. How else are we going to survive Russia? I mean, if the West is not going to disagree with Russia about us, I mean, that's the only way, no? So, I mean, suddenly it changed, and since then, I mean, and what helped also, like, this forming this kind of anti-Russian movement was presidential elections and Salome thing. Because when actually Bidzina proposed Salome, I mean, the whole second round, like the current president of Georgia, the whole second round was about who's more pro-Russian. And that's what they were using against each other. So even though the presidential elections ended up with a bad result for me, because I didn't want Salome to be sitting there, it ended also like really well, because then NDI polls were issued, and like support for NATO integration and support for EU integration is skyrocketing. It's on the record high, because and also what works, I think that the West started to realize that there is a hybrid warfare going on. They started to spend money on propaganda. I mean, it's working. It's working slowly, but, you know, like steadily, it's working. And we see now all the young people like standing, protesting against Russia. I don't know if they have realized like what they're protesting against, I mean, and how bad Russia is and how stable that is. But so far they're standing in the street, and it's a problem for the organizers of the rally to let them go home and like ask them to come back again. Because last night, it was a problem to tell them, okay, we're done now, come back tomorrow. They didn't want to go.
Yeah. Sure. Do we have one more question, perhaps? Lindsay. Can someone...
This is really a question for Peter, but it would be great to hear the others reflect on it. I've been to a lot of protests in a lot of countries. The Arab Spring, amazing protests, and we all know how disastrously a lot of that ended up. Venezuela this year, massive numbers of people in the streets. Government pays no attention. Occasionally they shoot somebody or there's tear gas. It doesn't make any difference. What are the new methods of protest which can actually be effective? Because this business of people coming out on the streets, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, governments are learning they can just ignore it.
So again, I'm just quoting the people that I interviewed. I'm not sort of like, you know, I'm not the mastermind here. So they would argue that actually it was never about the protest on the street was always the last stage of months and years of strategy and preparation. And if they're working well, you're very much in control as the organizer of why they're happening and what you want to achieve, which is what Tamar is talking about. So actually the problem slightly is the internet. People can come out really quickly, people get inflamed, social media is great at kind of getting numbers out there, but terrible for building strategy. Actually, what he said is that it was much better in the 90s, kind of in the 80s, all these like, you know, really politically minded people planning, gathering, slowly building the momentum. Social media gets you too fast, and then there's nothing there. The Arab Spring, there was no strategy for when the protests worked. They got into power, and then they're like, oh, military, you take it now, as if that was going to be a good idea. So there's a real failure to plan beyond. I mean, one of the great things of the Rose Revolution was, for the first time at least, it wasn't just, you know, it wasn't just protest, it was a whole reform plan for 4 years that was amazing. Second 4 years we can talk about, but still incredible. It really was thought through. But in terms of, so we're in a slightly different space. On the other hand, I do think there's a lot of excitement and interesting things you can do with the internet. In terms, we have to do it in a much cleverer way, in terms of really understanding what the social grievances are. So I interviewed kind of next generation protesters in Mexico, who they looked at the way Google Analytics predicted flu epidemics. I think you all know this, so Google managed to anticipate a flu epidemic by understanding that people were looking for subjects around flu in a very concentrated way. So they tried to do this for social protest. Are people in a bit of Mexico starting to ask a lot about unemployment or ecology? Are there burgeoning movements that we can anticipate and then build unity across? So I think maybe we have to start looking at using social media diagnostics and strategizing in a much cleverer way than simply kind of Twitter storms and getting people out. So that'll probably be the way forward. Well, that's exactly what they do. So they start intervening. And that's what's so horrible about kind of like the trolls and the bots are horrible in so many ways, but essentially by distorting the real social media discussion, the governments are sort of not allowing the people to sort of get in contact with their own kind of revolutionary reality. And that's why the governments do it. That's why they try to intervene there. But that's where the battle is.
I would lie if I would tell you that I know, like, in response how the protest should be. I don't know. But, I mean, according to what I've noticed, for instance, we had one successful protest, which was about the guy who was killed, like, during the street. I mean, two teenagers, actually, were killed, like, in the street fight. And, like, the government was covering up one of the killers, like, who, I mean, alleged killer, like, who was the relative of the prosecutor's whatever employee or whatever, and the protest has started and the government backed down by creating the commission. And I noticed that for this government what makes sense is that if they see the protest is like genuine and coming from the people, general public, and it's not like the supporters of one party and it's the cross party or whatever, no party representation, then they get frightened and they make some steps. Like now, I mean, you don't see any party supporters there. I mean, some of the people, like most of the people who are standing there just hate parties. I mean, really, I mean, we don't need any politicians. And that, I know that's infantile, but that's how it is. I mean, when you're trying to explain that, okay, you are asking for a proportional system, and it has to be like MPs who are going to negotiate it afterwards, and they have to adopt, they have to change the constitution, they just don't want to hear about it. And frankly, I don't care. I mean, let them like protest as long as the government compromises after that and we get the democratic system. I mean, it doesn't make any sense for me. But what works here in Georgia if the protest is diverse? Because we had one successful example with Cheirgoleshvili, the guy, the father of the guy, like who was killed, and this is also like partly successful. I mean, not yet. We're not there yet. When the chairman of the parliament has already resigned, but it was already too late after government had dispersed already dispersed the rally, and 305 people are in prison, and like two have like lost their eye and all these things. So now, chairman of the parliament is not enough, of course.
So I'm also addressing that question. I think the first thing is a strategy. It was nice to have it, and the genuine aggression in crowd, because you can't make people angry. What we observed during these years, you really can't make people angry. You can't say to them like, you know, Russia is bad all the time, until this MP is coming and really makes people angry, really, really, physically. So this is one thing. So genuinely angry people, but you also need a strong leader. And today, last year we saw very successful and very unsuccessful rally. It was in, then again, the police came to the Bassiani club and a lot of clubs. They arrested people. They called them drug dealers. And a lot of young people, like ravers, basically came to the Rustaveli Street again. This is our favorite street to protest stuff. And then there was a huge party, and the main motto of this party was we dance together, we fight together. It was quite nice to observe, really, full of ravers, street, everybody are dancing. And for government it was really shocking, I guess, because it was really first time when the large crowd came without politicians. But also at the same day, we saw a huge problem because the young people, they said, we don't need politicians here on the stage. What happened, the very experienced Ministry of Internal Affairs came to the protesters, and he just, with one tuck, he manipulated the crowd. He spoke with these, I don't call them children, but politically they were, definitely. And he said, like, there is another aggressive crowd, they want to beat you, so I will protect you, please give me, or trust me, I don't know, just leave the territory and tomorrow we will speak about something. He started his speech with very beautiful Georgian Bodishi, which means excuse me, and people were very happy with that. What happened? Crowd were sent to home, and the aggressive crowd came to that place, and he won. The politician won. Nothing really changed. So we see today the risk that the same thing will repeat again, because again people are saying we don't need the politicians, but they really don't have the leaders yet. The leaders who the people will follow. So yesterday people are staying there still waiting for something, but this something, I think, the leader should be born. I don't know how it happens, so I don't know how to stuff, but we are waiting, right?
Okay, it's already with the microphone, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for all four speakers. I want to differentiate between protest and singular protest here and there, and ideology of protest. I mean, especially someone like Peter, is what he says is a bit frustrating for me, because it seems that he belongs to post-1990, when all protests were good protests because they were all looking for liberal democracy and Western values, and they want to join the Western bloc, so we celebrated protests. Now, let me take you back to 30th June 2013, when the biggest protest on earth happened in Cairo, Alexandria. About 10 million, they claimed, the organizer claimed, came on Tamar Road movement, and what they did, they destroyed the democratically elected government of Morsi, whether you like him or not, and they handed over the power to a dictatorship, killed 800 people on one day, 80,000 people are still in prison, and the president died like a dog in the court 3 days ago, and no one cared in the world. So I think from that moment onward, we should at least accept that gathering of human beings next to each other can be manipulated. As Woody Allen says, it is true that I'm paranoid, but it doesn't mean that someone is not following me. It is true that protests are not necessarily manipulated by CIA or Putin, but doesn't mean that they can if Twitter and Facebook can manipulate masses of people, so anyone can do that. So my question is, in 2019, should we still be that enthusiastic about the concept of protest, or should we be worried because protests can deliver fascism and populism and a stronger, more authoritarian governments?
Yeah, So even more than that, so I asked the people in the book, it's even worse than that. Actually, these guidebooks that Srđan Popović and Otpor, the Yugoslav revolutionaries, developed, I spent a lot of my time on hard right websites, because that's partly what I research. And you see these hard right European neo-Nazis, who don't look like neo-Nazis anymore, saying, we love Srđan Popović, this is the way we're going to take power. And I interviewed one who's the leader of the Identitarians, who basically, it's the opposite, he's almost like Milosevic. He wants to get rid of all Muslims in Europe. And I interviewed him, he was like, yeah, Srđan Popović and Otpor are my hero. I am following their guidebook in order to get rid of all the, all Muslims from Europe and do ethnic cleansing. And they've borrowed even more of the ideas. They're like, I said, but hold on, those protests were for democracy, for freedom, for rights. He's like, we live under the dictatorship of the left, under the dictatorship of political correctness. What about the rights of the white person? So they've even taken the language of liberal revolutions and using it for the far right. So yeah, completely. So I actually asked Popović, so what about, what's the, how do you feel about, avowedly people with very different ideology to you using your tactics? And he actually said, yes, that does happen. The only thing that he could say was because his methodology was about building consensus, it should probably lead to better tolerance and better dialogue in society. So his methodology should produce a better liberal discourse. But that was the only thing he could say. But yeah, no, completely. The greatest revolutionary guidebook is Lenin, and he was a dickhead.
Well, I completely agree with you. Even now, with the protests going on in the street, I'm afraid that if the government doesn't make any compromise and the process goes out of the control, then we may end up with the dictatorship of another guy who was driven by ideas back in 2003. Now he's driven only by power, the search for power. So, I mean, there are no ideas. I mean, he's saying whatever. I mean, he's just fighting some tourists like from Asian countries, or he's just saying that we should be bankrupting the rich people, or he's saying whatever. I mean, there is no idea. There's just long for power. So I'm afraid, of course, that these protests, which are really good right now, it's against Russia and it has a noble purpose. Like, if the government doesn't make the right concessions and right compromises, it may end up with something really dangerous.
Sure, over here. Very enthusiastic hand.
So we're talking about protests, which is negative, if you will. It's fighting against something. We have an independent country that had for decades a goal of achieving independence, achieving statehood again, and that's obviously a concrete line in the sand. Now we have this. What is the new goal? What's the moment? What does success look like? Because it's quite clear, but you have so many different issues. You have the 20% of the territory being occupied. You have all of the other kind of gray areas of billionaires manipulating politics and so on. I read that the average age of last night's protest was 20, which is staggering. I mean, the average age. So what will success look like for them? What will make them actually one day go, oh, we don't need to do that anymore because we got what we wanted?
Change of the electoral system. They want proportional system. A majority of them, all of the speakers, like who were just random speakers, they were just going, picking up the microphone. They're all talking about, at the 20, 19, 15-year-old people, they're talking on proportional system. I'm not sure they're understanding what they're talking about. What I'm sure about is that they don't want one person like to be in charge of everything. They want balanced government, and that would be considered as a success. If government makes the compromise and they come up with some sort of like dialogue idea about changing the electoral system for 2020, I'm sure crowd's going to be happy. They're going to claim the victory. They're going to go home.
Another thing.
Do we need to finish right now? Or?
Can I just try to answer? Another thing is that because of the violence, definitely somebody has to take a responsibility, and this somebody for the protesters is definitely the Minister of Internal Affairs. So one of the things they want, the speakers say all the time, is that he should resign. And now, additionally, we step by step, in 2 days, it was shocking, but we start to realize that actually the government damaged our citizens' health and the right for living even because of the Russia. So a lot of people, the young people, are angry because of that, because you can't damage your citizens because of other country. So what they want the responsibility for taking care of these people. This is all the time what we hear, because government has to pay for it. Because we speak about the huge damages, like a lot of people lost their eyes and stuff. And then another thing is what I forget.
And also this night when they dispersed the riot was already coined like as Gavrilov night, like Bartholomeo's night, Long Night's night, and Knife's night, and now it's called like Gavrilov night. So dispersing rally for something, like when there is one thing, but dispersing rally because they were protesting against the visit of Russian Duma MP and making people blind because of that, it's a huge problem for the government.
Okay, so we're back to where we started. I would love to talk some more. I thought we had a bit more time, but I'm being told that we have to finish now. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
We have 2 comments here.
Okay, we have some comments here.
First
please.
of all, I have to, just to be fair, I have to point out that the previous government didn't take our dignity, just dignity, no. They used to take our lives, and many citizens have died during that time. So saying that they are taking away our dignity, I think is disrespectful. But my question is, if you think that the guy you talk about is so crazy, and he's been so crazy from the start, why did you stood by him and your husband for so long? This is I really want to know.
Well, I
Because
don't think...
I take you for a person
I
who is
know-
a
I- I
forward-looking, very educated, very intellectual. I think.
Thank you.
No, I really think so. And you must have been the first person who would know that he was making mistakes, and the power next to him was making mistakes. Why weren't you so
Okay,
vocal back then?
I understand,
we got the point of the
understand your
question.
question. I don't think that's the right place for political debate because, I mean, I see we have a different political taste. I mean, first of all, like Elizabeth first has said, I'm not going to dig the windows into people's soul. I don't care what kind of guy Saakashvili was. I cared about the choices he made. And the choices he made was to, like, sort of reform Georgia. And as Peter has said, during the first 4 years of his ruling, like, was miraculous for Georgia. That's why I consider, it's not the debate here. That's one thing. The second, that's why I supported him. That's why I supported him, because, like, Georgia, he was making Georgia a successful country, and I could see the positive changes, and that's why I supported him.
Okay, I don't think we're going to turn this into a personal polemic. if that's
Again,
okay.
I mean, you are balancing. You are measuring advantages and disadvantages. You are looking at the alternative. Who should have I supported that? Grechicha? Huh?
Okay.
That was the alternative? No. Why? And who should I have supported? Life is about choices. Life is about choices.
Guys.
Sometimes you have to make hard choices. And that when you see the
We can carry this on outside after the panel, please. Do we have one more question? Is there anyone else you would like to take on the panel?
No, not me. I don't know whether this is a question or an observation or a bit of both, but just back to the question at the start, which is how you go about organising a protest to succeed. Isn't there a point that you try to tailor the protest to match your enemy or what the event is? So, I mean, for example, I don't think it's entirely true to say that mass protests can never succeed anymore, because they just went in Hong Kong the other day, for example. The Chinese government dropped the extradition law. Equally, in the UK...
Could you talk a bit louder?
Sorry, I beg your pardon. In the UK, Extinction Rebellion are obviously making headway through much smaller but much more disruptive sorts of protests, right? So back to the issue at hand in Georgia, I don't know whether you agree that trying to storm Parliament in a kind of a Route One way is arguably less successful than that thing behind you on the screen there, that occupied thing, which seems to me to be really, really compelling, because apart from anything else, it raises awareness of the fact that much of the outside world doesn't know that 20% of the country is still occupied by the Russians. And I think you're probably likely to get more awareness raised through doing that than by trying to charge Parliament.
Okay, we don't have that much time, so if anyone would like to make a brief response.
So the question was, can you repeat or summarize?
So the question was about whether storming the Route One sort of protest of, charging riot police to, for some reason, get into the parliament to make that protest might be less successful or a less subtle way of protesting, and potentially successful way of protesting than something like Occupy.
Well, what I can answer to that, in 2012, there was a huge protest against the former government, and really a lot of, I never saw in my life, I guess, as much people as it was in 2012. So a lot of people were upset with that. And my friends who were supporting this rally, they said that when the former government resigned, so when they deliberate power to the opposition, my friends said that this was not the will of the former government, it was because of the pressure of citizens of Georgia. And this is true. The former government knew that if he will not give the power to the opposition, those people will do something bad. For example, storming the parliament, including. So I think that let's take Germany, a peaceful country, but I think that if in Germany somebody does something bad in political terms, people will protest, and in the end, they will also use the violence as a tool. So I think that the showing to the government that you are, because of your ideas, you will go to the violent, you will take the shots, it makes the government to change their mind, because just because of standing there outside, and we are there, we are a lot, change something. I don't think that changes happen like that. We are doing posters since 7 years already about the oligarchy in Georgia, about a lot of stuff, Russia including, but this real power struggle made what we see today. This is what I think.
We're running out of time, so I want to finish off by asking all of you
Can I have one question?
one more question. Okay, sure.
So,
Being out-moderated.
so just one question, please. So, before this protest, a few days earlier, we saw that there were guys coming together and saying that LGBTQ community is not for us. And we can say that there is also a Putin narrative, and they were intimidating by this, the Western world. And now we see that Putin also tried Russian MP in our parliament, just see what was happening. And we saw this big protest, huge protest in our country. And I don't want to sound like God's character saying winter is coming back, but August is coming, and we have quite a heavy history about that. So is this thing that we should be worrying about? Is there some kind of signs of maybe war is coming? Because, you know, Putin also banned the flights in Tbilisi, and we say that, yeah, we don't care about these things because we don't want Russian tourists, and I'm on the board with that, but he also said that don't let our citizens to go in Georgia, and we also heard previously Putin said that we need to protect our citizen and coming Georgia and starting war. So is there a thing, or it's just me?
So it's not really a question about protest then, it's a question about...
It's generally, yeah.
It's like, yeah, well,
about the future, what
we had to get there in the end, yeah.
May I? Yeah, I
Briefly,
understand
if
your
you
question.
can.
First of all, I agree with you. The previous, I think the call to storm the parliament was a horrible decision and a horrible mistake. I don't think that, I mean, it should be, I completely support non-violent protests, and I don't think that we should be frightening the government like with violent actions, because we are frightening the population. Actually, it's the public we are frightening with the violent storming and all these things. I mean, I completely disagree with the decision of the UNM, one of the leaders, like to call the people to storm the parliament. I think it was a rookie mistake. But I mean, that's on. Let's put it on the side. Like about your question, I mean, whoever is interested in Russian hybrid warfare, like this week was a good example, because like first Russia was using its propaganda that okay, the West is going to make you gay, the US ambassador is asking you to protect the gay rights, so you see I'm coming from Russia and I'm the like your sort of fellow Orthodox guy, you know, wearing folk clothes, having 9 children, completely like sort of a hypocrite, but of course, I mean, that was his narrative. And then like when the protests happened, we saw economic measures. And the thing is that like this propaganda also included the part of the subversive operations where he's using espionage, because the guys the parties that supported this crazy clown, Vasadze, are pro-Russian, openly pro-Russian parties like Patriots Alliance and all these things. So, I mean, that was one part of the story, like how it started, the protest, because the unrest in town, that's how it started in Tbilisi. Like last weekend, I was standing at the chancellery, like in the, together with 15 gays, which were attacked by, I don't know, like thousands of, like some sort of demonstrations, crazies, sort of. And now, when the protest like is like already like includes like about 30,000 people, now what they did is that they are using economic measures. So like it's like the full spectrum of hybrid warfare we should expect from Russia. And like I mean, we should be kind of really, how to say, nobody can answer you that question. We don't know what Russia is going to do. I mean, how can I tell you that, like, tomorrow Putin will not decide to bomb us because, like, he decided so? But, I mean, the only way to protect ourselves, like, from that is just to get ourselves completely out of Russia influence and enter NATO. I mean, that's the only way to protect us, and that's the only, there is no alternative. We just have to walk towards NATO, walk towards like security, like provided by North Atlantic Alliance, and that's the only thing that's going to save us from like, otherwise, I mean, there is no alternative. So we have no other way, like other to respond in that way.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I want to just zoom out a little bit away from that issue and just finish up, because we're talking about storytelling and the narratives of protest. And I'm curious, like, you know, Peter, globally, and perhaps you guys about Georgia, you know, we often talk about the things that autocrats are most scared of is humor, is people laughing at them, is, you know, instead of making an angry protest, making a satirical protest. And, you know, we were talking about Ghambashidze earlier. I mean, he seems, this guy, kind of zebra-keeping weird billionaire that lives in a castle, he seems pretty ripe for satire. Perhaps Saakashvili also pretty ripe for satire. How do you, is that part of the protest here, and is that something that can be used more, and is that something that they're scared of? Perhaps you could talk about the Georgian situation, and then Peter, you might have something to say more globally.
Yes, we are using satire. I love using a satire. I'm famous for ridiculing everything and everybody. Sometimes I'm even getting in trouble for that. Well, yes, we are using satirical tools. And once I was arrested for that because I was putting satirical posters on Ivanishvili at the fence, of the construction fence.
But is it
so,
effective?
Yes. Huh?
Does it work as a technique?
Well, yes, it does.
Or does it just make you feel better?
But everything in complex does work. Yes, people do not like to be ridiculed, but in the end, they are getting used to it. They like power more. So I mean, they're not giving up power just because they are getting ridiculed. They have to be frightened by complex measures. You have to use full spectrum of power, which includes satire, which includes street protests, which includes pressure in the parliament, which includes pressure from the international community. So that's what we're using.
Yeah, sure.
So everybody who knows Georgia, and it's active on Facebook, on other social media, basically Facebook, they know that this is the thing we don't and never lacked in the political discourse, the humor. So whatever happens, we transform it directly to something very funny, and then we target it. And it helps us a little bit to live, because otherwise we'll be just, it's disaster. Every day something very strange happens. You want to respond already? Okay. Why it's important that basically whoever we are, we seriously believe that whatever we believe is truth, right? And we have to act as if it is really truth. And acting like that, it means that you have to take it seriously. For example, you have to take seriously your role as a writer, for example. And if you are too serious about that, this is your identity afterwards. Oh, no. And you want other people to take your identity also as serious as you take. For example, she mentioned a lot of times this guy. He's the Wasadze. She called him clown, but in reality, he's given by our royal family the title of knight. He's a knight. And he seriously thinks that he's a knight, right? So what we do is just we ridicule him, and to say that in 21st century, being the knight of the Georgian royal family, which never really existed, and it's already a strange story, and we make fun, and this fun takes all the legitimacy of his seriosity. So wherever he does very nice speech about whatever, then you put some, for example, this diversity flag of LGBT rights next to him. For example, last time he was sitting with a stick like Gandalf, but it was a cross stick, sitting with the chocha Georgian dress after praying against LGBT people. Crazy. And he was sitting and just put the little bit horse in his hand, like baby horse, and the flag, and then it already looks ridiculous. So if something looks ridiculous, it has no power anymore to act seriously. And this is what
we are using that against these crazy pro-Russian reactionary groups all the time.
We're really running out of time, so Peter, quick final comment if you have one.
What, humor? Look, humor is great, exactly. It's empowering, it strips the powerful of this aura of fear, and it's a great way of communicating with people. We're talking about reaching social groups that aren't listening. Humor is a great way to do that. However, I'm kind of a little bit, I don't think satire is actually very useful these days as a strategy. Satire is all about, it's very negative, it's all about kind of like, it doesn't help you develop a positive vision of where you want to go at the end of the day. It was very effective against communism, because communism had all this pretentiousness, and you could make fun of it and satirize it. in a world where leaders like Putin don't have a positive vision, they're satirists themselves. They're constantly taunting the West. They're saying, ha, 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 you guys say you have democratic values, but actually it's all bullshit. Being satirical is a mode that they're very, very comfortable with. I don't think satire works against these kind of nihilists. So humor, yes, but satire, I think that was a very 20th century strategy. I'm not sure that helps you develop the alternative vision that we need to develop. Quite the opposite. I think we need a bit of sincerity and a little bit of positivity. That's what we're lacking.
Okay, thank you very much to the three panelists.